Hello, this is part 11 of our comparative Bible study on the beginning of Jesus Galilean Ministry. During this part, we would like to wrap up our discussion on Jesus calling some of his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. Overall, this is our 51st New Testament Bible study. During the last Bible study, we discussed an event that appears to have been recorded in both the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, and we compared that event to a similar sounding event in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5. We discussed whether these could be all the same event, or two different events, or something else. During this Bible study, I would like to discuss a possible timeline that would harmonize in particular the Gospels of Mark and Luke together. During this particular period in time, the Gospels of Mark and Luke match up pretty well and have a lot of overlap and would probably provide us the best comparison as to whether or not this is one event or two events. Timeline-wise, the biggest difference between these events in the Gospels of Mark and Luke has to do with where they occurred with respect to Jesus re-entering Capernaum. In particular, the events in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee and called Simon and Andrew to himself, telling them that they would become fishers of men, and then also called James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. Those happened before Jesus returned to Capernaum. Notice here how Mark chapter 1 verse 20 ends with, "And straightway he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the ship with the hired servants and went after him." And verse 21, the very next verse reads, "And they went into Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught." So this event in the Gospel of Mark is clearly before Jesus re-entered Capernaum. Different from this, the events in Luke chapter 5, where Jesus called his disciples to himself, occurred after Jesus returned to Capernaum. So let's walk through these verses consecutively to see how they go together. Once again, from the beginning, Jesus is walking by the Sea of Galilee, and he calls Peter and Andrew, James and John to himself. That is in Mark chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. Then in the very next verse, verse 21, it states, "And they went into Capernaum." Just to display it a little bit differently, Mark chapter 1, verse 21, the beginning, which states, "And they went into Capernaum." In this whole section, Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 28, is covering Jesus entering into the synagogue in Capernaum and casting an unclean spirit out of a man. That correlates to Luke chapter 4, verses 31 through 37, which covers the same account basically. So let's look at Mark chapter 1, verse 29, which would be the following verse after this section, and Luke chapter 4, verse 38, which would be the next verse after this section. So here we are in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 34, the very next section in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus came out of the synagogue and went into Peter and Andrew's house and healed Peter's mother-in-law, and went on to cast out devils and heal diseases of the people who gathered together at the door. Likewise, Luke chapter 4, verses 38 through 41, which is the very next section from the previous slide. Jesus again exits the synagogue, goes into Peter's house, heals Peter's mother-in-law, and heals those who are brought to him of diseases and cast out devils. So you can see how the Gospels of Mark and Luke are matching up very well. Let's move on to the next verses in each Gospel, which would be Mark chapter 1, verse 35, and Luke chapter 4, verse 42. So as you can see, the very next sections in the Gospel of Mark and Luke are saying similar things again. Jesus, when it was day in the morning, went to a solitary place or desert place. Other people were seeking him. He said he must go into other places to preach, and in fact he does go into other synagogues in Galilee and preach. As stated at the end of each of these sections. So Luke chapter 4 verse 44 is the very last verse in chapter 4 of the Gospel of Luke, which would bring us to Luke chapter 5, which is where Jesus entered into Peter's ship and then later told Peter where he could catch a multitude of fishes, and he did, so much that their net brake. Peter had the strong reaction where he said to Jesus, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." And then Jesus told him, "Fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men." Having gone through all that, it appears that if both the Gospels of Mark and Luke are chronological, then there are two different events. One recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark prior to Jesus re-entering Capernaum, and this other event here in Luke chapter 5 after Jesus re-entered Capernaum. Now, if the Gospel of Mark is not necessarily chronological, it would be kind of easy just to say that the Gospel of Mark account and the Gospel of Luke account are one and the same, and maybe the Gospel of Mark is listed a little bit out of order. On the other hand, regarding the Gospel of Luke, there are many who believe that the Gospel of Luke is indeed chronological. One significant reason for this that I've seen referenced has to do with the introduction to the Gospel of Luke. There, in the beginning of chapter 1, it states, "It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order." If this introduction to the Gospel of Luke is indeed indicating that the Gospel of Luke is in chronological order, then this event in Luke chapter 5 must be in the correct location. So even if the Gospel of Luke is in chronological order, as discussed before, a lot of the Gospels have information in addition to what the other Gospels state, and there's still plenty of things that need to be harmonized because the Gospel of Luke does not include every event. So could that be the case here? The Gospel of Mark is recording an event not in the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of Luke is recording an extra event that's not in the Gospel of Mark. That being the case, we would have at least two different instances of Jesus calling his disciples by the Sea of Galilee at different times. Let's explore a possible timeline of Jesus' interactions with his disciples. Among others, Jesus met Andrew and Peter right after being baptized, and then he and his disciples went to the marriage in Cana of Galilee, and then they went to Capernaum for not many days until Jesus went to the Passover. Then, while at the Passover, the disciples see many amazing things. And then, after the Passover, they stay in the land of Judea, where the disciples baptize other disciples. And then they return to the land of Galilee, passing through the land of Samaria, the disciples still being with Jesus at that time. Then maybe, and I'm only proposing this, after they get into the land of Galilee, Andrew and Peter, maybe they break off from Jesus. And Jesus himself returned to his hometown of Nazareth for a period of time, then maybe passed through Cana of Galilee. Then he approaches to the Sea of Galilee on his way to Capernaum and reunites with Peter and Andrew. And they're so excited to see Jesus when he calls them to himself that they forsake their nets and take off with him. Then they re-enter into Capernaum, where Jesus cast an unclean spirit out of a man in the synagogue, then leaves the synagogue and goes into Peter and Andrew's house, where he conducts additional miracles there. Then leaving from there, Jesus tells him that he must preach in other areas of Galilee. Then at some point in time after that, Jesus once again calls his disciples by the Sea of Galilee, and they go with him to go preaching again. Again, I'm just sharing this as a possibility. If I get to share anything good, it's a blessing from God. Lord willing, maybe we'll have another Bible study in the future. Thank you. Goodbye.